There's a version of this story where I never find out, where I walk down the aisle, say my vows, take the photographs, and spend the next 30 years believing the woman I married had simply come from a family too broken to show up for her wedding. That version of the story was available to me. I chose a different one. What I found on that Saturday morning in May, parked outside a brick colonial in Marietta, Georgia, watching through my windshield while my fiancé's father stood on his front porch and laughed with his neighbors like a man with absolutely nothing to hide. That image broke something in me that I'm still piecing back together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Drop your city in the comments below. And stay with me, because this one is going to take every bit of those 3 parts to tell right. My name is Hill Harper. In March of 2025, I was 35 years old, a civil rights and employment attorney with my own practice on Peachtree Street, NW, and, as of the 8th day of that month, newly engaged to a woman named Christina Highmore. I want to tell you about Christina the way I actually knew her. Before all of it, because none of this makes sense without understanding what she was like when it was good. She was 33, a marketing director at a mid-sized hospitality company in Buckhead, and she had the kind of self-possession that made you feel steadier just by being near her. She laughed with her whole body. She remembered the names of your co-workers' children. She kept a running list on her phone of restaurants she wanted to try and crossed them off with a small celebration every time we actually made it to one. I had dated women who made my life feel smaller. Christina was the first one who made it feel like it had more room in it than I'd been using. We met at a fundraiser for a legal aid nonprofit in the Old Fourth Ward, a neighborhood in Atlanta where civil rights history is not abstract. It is in the brickwork, in the names on the streets. She was there representing her company's charitable giving program. I was there because I'd helped the nonprofit with a discrimination case the year before, pro bono, and they'd invited me as a guest. We were both reaching for the same glass of sparkling water at the same moment, and she looked at me and said, without missing a beat, "I hope you're not about to tell me that was yours." 2 years later, I proposed to her in the same neighborhood, on Auburn Avenue, outside the birth home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because I am a man who believes that the places where you begin things matter. Yes came out of her before I finished the sentence. I want to be exact about when things started feeling wrong, because I am an attorney, and precision is the only tool I trust when I am trying to reconstruct something I should have caught earlier. It was the weekend after the engagement, Saturday, March 22nd. We were having dinner at my law partner James Freeman's house in Decatur. Just a small celebration, with people close to us, and Christina was warm and funny and exactly herself all evening. But when James's wife Helen asked about her family, whether her parents were excited, whether she had siblings, Christina smiled and said, "Oh, we're not really a close family. It's fine. Hill knows." I nodded, because I did know something. I knew that Christina had described her parents as complicated, that she rarely called them, that she'd told me early in our relationship that her upbringing had not been warm. I had respected that without pressing. That, I would come to understand, was my first mistake. Not the trusting, which was right, but the not asking, which was not. Over the following weeks, as we began the early architecture of a wedding, venue, guest list, a date we'd set for August 9th, Christina's position on her family grew more defined and more rigid. "I'd really like to invite your parents," I told her one evening in late March, sitting at our kitchen table in our midtown apartment with a draft guest list between us. "I've never met them. We're getting married in 4 months. They won't be able to make it, Hill." Her voice was level. "Careful, my dad has bad knees. Travel is hard for them. Marietta is 25 minutes away." Christina, a pause. Just a fraction of a second too long. "You know what I mean. Big events are overwhelming for him. It's not a reflection of how they feel about us." I let it go that night. I am not proud of that, but I understood, or thought I did, what it felt like to protect a wound you weren't ready to name out loud. My own father had left our family in Southwest Atlanta when I was 9 years old, and for years I had answered questions about him with the same flat economy Christina used now. You learn not to pick at other people's scar tissue, but something had snagged in the back of my mind, and it didn't let go. Marietta. She'd said Marietta without hesitation, without thinking, which meant it was just there, sitting in her mouth, The place she came from, available on reflex, unstudied, bad knees. 25 minutes away. On a Saturday. I am an attorney. I notice when the explanation doesn't fit the facts. Over the next several weeks, I watched for patterns. The way you watch a witness in deposition, not obviously, not with any visible change in my attention, just quietly cataloging. I noticed that Christina never called her parents in front of me. Not once. I noticed that her phone screen tilted slightly away when it buzzed on weekend mornings. I noticed that when my mother Dorothy called from Cascade Heights to talk about the wedding, she'd already started researching florists, which is exactly the kind of thing my mother does. Christina's smile during those calls had a thin quality I couldn't name until later. What I could name, later, was that the smile looked like relief. Like someone who was grateful for a version of family that worked the way it was supposed to. I had exactly one piece of hard information. I knew her parents' names from a tax document she'd left on the counter the previous year, a refund check for something or other that had come to our address after she changed her mailing address, Gerald and Anna Highmore, and an address in Marietta. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to present myself as someone who was operating from suspicion alone. What I was operating from was concern. There is a difference, and I think it matters. I didn't think Christina was dangerous. I didn't think she was being malicious. I thought she was in pain about something she couldn't tell me. And I thought that pain was big enough that it was starting to shape the architecture of our life together. The guest list, the wedding, the stories she told about herself, and I needed to understand it before I stood up in front of everyone I loved and promised to share the rest of my life with it. On the morning of Saturday, May 10th, while Christina was at a bachelorette brunch for a colleague in Buckhead, I drove north on I-75. 27 minutes. That's how long it took me to get from our apartment in Midtown Atlanta to a street in Marietta, Georgia, where a brick colonial sat behind a clean, mowed lawn with a basketball hoop in the driveway and 2 cars parked out front. I did not get out of the car. I want to be clear about that. I'm an attorney. I know the difference between gathering information and making a scene, and that morning I was only doing the first thing. I parked across the street with my coffee, and I watched the house the way I'd watched 100 courthouses in my career, patiently, without expectation, waiting for the truth to show itself on its own schedule. It took 11 minutes. The front door opened. A man came out, early 60s, solid build, a Braves cap, a coffee mug in his hand. He walked to the edge of the porch, leaned against the railing, and waved to a neighbor across the street who was pulling a trash can down to the curb. They exchanged something, a joke, maybe, based on the laugh, and the neighbor waved back. And the man on the porch stood there in the morning sun, with his coffee and his cap, with the absolute settled ease of a man who had nowhere in the world to be and was perfectly content with that fact. Gerald Highmore, 61 years old, bad knees, 25 minutes from our apartment. I sat in that car for a long time after he went back inside. I want you to understand that what I felt was not anger. Not yet. What I felt was the cold, clean sensation of a question you have been carefully not asking, finally demanding an answer. I didn't say anything to Christina that weekend. I know that might be hard to understand, but I needed to think, and I needed more information. And I have learned over 15 years of practicing law that the most dangerous thing you can do in a difficult situation is move before you know what you're actually dealing with. I spent that week quietly, asking myself the hardest question I had. What was she hiding, and from whom? Because here was the thing that didn't fit the shape of any story I wanted to believe. If Christina's parents were the problem, if they were abusive, dangerous, the kind of people she'd built a life away from and needed to keep at distance, she would have told me. She had told me about other hard things, about a friendship that ended badly in her mid-20s, about a job she'd lost and grieved. She was not a woman who flinched from telling me when something had hurt her. So why this? Why this wall around one particular address 25 minutes up the interstate? The answer that kept surfacing, the one I turned over and set back down 4 times that week before I was willing to look directly at it, was this. Maybe it wasn't her parents she was hiding from me. Maybe it was me she was hiding from them. On the following Saturday, May 17th, I told Christina I was going into the office to prep for a Monday deposition. I kissed her goodbye at 8:15 in the morning, got in my car, and drove north on I-75 for the second time in a week. This time, I knocked on the door. I had thought about this moment carefully. I am good at preparing for moments. In 15 years of law, I have walked into rooms where I was not wanted and stood my ground without raising my voice, and I leaned on every gram of that training as I stood on Gerald and Anna Highmore's front porch on a Saturday morning in May and waited. The woman who answered the door was in her late 50s, trim and sharp-eyed, wearing a cardigan and the expression of someone who did not recognize the man on her porch and was deciding how to feel about that. "Mrs. Highmore?" I kept my voice easy. Lawyer voice. The one that says, "I am not a threat, and I am not going anywhere." "My name is Hill Harper. I'm engaged to your daughter Christina. I think it's past time we met." The silence that followed was one of the most interesting silences I have ever witnessed, and I have cross-examined people under oath. It wasn't surprise, exactly, or rather, it was, but layered underneath the surprise was something else, something that looked, with chilling precision, like recognition. She knew who I was. She stopped, looked past me at the driveway, at my car, back at me. "Christina didn't say you were coming. Christina doesn't know I'm here." Another silence. Then, from behind her, Gerald Highmore's voice from somewhere inside the house. "Anna? Who is it?" She turned her head, and in the half-second before she answered him, I watched something move across her face. It was fast. But I catch things. That's what I do. It was shame. "Someone here to see us," she called back, her voice carefully neutral. Then she stepped aside, and she let me in. "I want to describe that house to you, because the details matter. It was clean, well-furnished, the kind of house that had been lived in carefully for 20 or 30 years, family photos on the hallway wall, a dining room table you could tell was used for actual Sunday dinners, bookshelves with a real mix of titles, not decorative spines. This was not a chaotic house. This was not a house of dysfunction or disorder. This was a house belonging to people who had done fine, who had built a solid life, who had no obvious reason that I could see in the first 60 seconds to be kept away from their daughter's engagement." Gerald came out of the kitchen, and to his credit, he didn't flinch when he saw me. He was a solid man, the kind who'd probably been athletic in his 40s and still carried the frame of it. He looked at me the way experienced men look at things they didn't plan for, squarely, without panic, recalibrating. "Mr. Highmore." I extended my hand. "I'm Hill Harper. I'm going to marry your daughter, and I'd like to understand why she hasn't told you that." He shook my hand. He didn't have a choice, really, and he knew it, and I think he respected the directness even if he didn't welcome what it meant. He gestured to the living room. We sat down, and what followed was 45 minutes that I will spend a long time turning over in my mind. It came out in pieces, the way these things always do. Not as a confession. Neither of them owed me a confession, strictly speaking, but as an unraveling. The more I asked, calmly and without aggression, the more the shape of it became clear. Gerald and Anna Highmore had known about me. They had known for months. Christina had told them about the man she was seeing, but she had not shown them a photograph, had not told them my full name, had not said anything, it became clear, that would have prepared them for me in particular. And when she had finally, tentatively described me in enough detail, at some point in the previous fall, before the engagement, the conversation had not gone well. "We didn't say she couldn't see you," Anna said, and her voice had the careful, loaded quality of someone who had rehearsed this distinction many times. "We said we had concerns." "What kind of concerns, Mrs. Highmore?" A pause. Gerald looked at the carpet. Background, Gerald's voice was flat, deliberate, upbringing, whether you two came from compatible places. "I am 35 years old. I have a law degree from Emory University. I have argued before federal judges. I have spent 15 years working to protect people from the exact category of harm that was currently being described to me in someone's living room, using the word compatible as though it were a neutral, objective term. Compatible, I kept my voice level. Meaning what, Exactly? Neither of them answered. And their silence was, of course, its own answer. The most complete one. I want to be honest with you about what that moment felt like, because I think the honest version matters more than the composed version. It felt like being 14 years old again, standing in a school hallway in Southwest Atlanta, being told by a teacher that she was surprised by how articulate I was. It felt like every version of that moment I had carried in my body since I was old enough to understand what was happening. It felt ancient and exhausting, and underneath all of it, deeply, profoundly sad. But I didn't say any of that. What came out instead was this. I want to understand something. Your daughter is 33 years old. She has been with me for 2 years. We are engaged. Does she know that this is the reason she's been keeping us apart? Or has she been managing both sides of this on her own? Gerald looked at Anna. Anna looked at her hands. She knows we had concerns, Anna said quietly. We never told her to hide anything. But you didn't tell her the concerns were unfair, either. No answer. Which was, again, an answer. I thanked them for their time. I meant it, actually. Because I am not a man who wastes gratitude even when the circumstances are hard, and I drove back to Atlanta. Christina was home when I got there. She was on the couch with her laptop, and she looked up with a smile that lasted exactly as long as it took her to read my face. Hill. Her voice had gone careful. What happened? I sat down across from her. Not next to her. Across, the way you sit when you need to see someone's face clearly. I went to Marietta this morning. The color left her face in a way I will not forget. I met your parents, both of them. Gerald's knees seemed fine. He walked me to the door himself. She closed her laptop, she set it on the cushion beside her, and she folded her hands in her lap. And she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something between grief and relief, the look of a person whose secret has finally found them, and is not sure yet whether to be afraid of that or grateful. How long? I asked. Not accusing. Just needing to know. How long have you known that their problem was with me specifically? Her eyes filled. Since October. October, 7 months before the wedding. 4 months before the engagement. She had gotten engaged to me already knowing. Christina, I kept my voice quiet, but I need you to understand, quiet is not the same as calm. You accepted my ring knowing your parents had told you they had a problem with who I am. You planned a wedding with me knowing they would not come to it, and that you had no intention of telling me why. You were going to let me stand up in front of my mother, my colleagues, everyone I know, and tell them your family was too unwell to travel 25 minutes. And you were never going to tell me the truth. She was crying now. I was going to fix it. I was working on them. I thought if I gave it enough time, if they saw how serious this was, they'd come around. But you didn't tell me you were working on anything. You let me believe there was nothing to work on. Because I was ashamed of them, Hill. I'm ashamed of where they are on this. It's not where I am. I know that. I believe that. But here's what I need you to understand. I leaned forward slightly, and I chose every word the way I choose words in a courtroom, not for impact, but for precision. You made a unilateral decision that I didn't deserve to know something that was directly about me. You decided what I could handle. You managed me, Christina, the way you'd manage a situation, not the way you'd treat a partner. And I cannot build a marriage on that foundation no matter how much I love you. She didn't have an answer for that. And I didn't expect one. I didn't know it then, sitting in our midtown apartment with the Atlanta afternoon going gold and quiet outside the windows, whether there was anything left to save. I didn't know whether love was going to be enough for what came next. What I did know, sitting there, was that for the first time in 2 years, I was finally in the same room as the truth. And that had to count for something. I left the apartment that evening and drove to my mother's house in Cascade Heights. Dorothy Harper is 62 years old and has raised one child entirely on her own since 1999. And she has approximately 0 patience for complicated situations being described with insufficient directness. Tell me what happened. She handed me a glass of sweet tea on her back porch while the last of the May evening settled over the neighborhood. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which for my mother is an act of profound effort. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. That girl loves you. My mother's voice, after a long pause, was certain. I know she does. And she's been sitting in the middle of something ugly, trying to hold both sides together by herself, and doing a bad job of it. Yes, and you're angry because she should have told you. I'm angry because she made a decision about what I deserve to know. About me. My mother set her glass down and looked at me with the particular expression she has worn my entire life when she is about to tell me something I am not fully ready to hear. Hill, you have spent 15 years in courtrooms fighting for people who've been treated as less than by other people's assumptions. You know better than most what that weight costs. Now, she paused. Do you think that girl doesn't know what it cost her to be in that house with her parents, hearing what they said, knowing it was about the man she's chosen? I didn't answer. Shame makes people do stupid things. Her tone was matter of fact, not unkind. It doesn't make them bad people. It makes them people who are drowning and trying not to pull you under with them. She picked up her glass again. That's not nothing. But it's not enough either, on its own. You're right about that. Christina called me twice that night. I let both calls go to voicemail. I'm not proud of that, but I needed one night without managing anyone else's feelings about the situation, including hers. I listened to the voicemails the next morning, standing in my mother's kitchen over coffee. The first one was crying an apology and the words "I'm so sorry" repeated in different formations until the message cut off. The second one, left around 11 at night, was different. I called my parents tonight. Her voice was rougher now, emptied out. I told them that what they said and the way they've behaved about this is not something I'm going to defend or negotiate around anymore. I told them that if they cannot come to our wedding and treat my fiancé with basic dignity and respect, they will not be part of my life. Not my marriage, not my holidays, not any of it. A pause. I could hear her breathing. I should have said that in October. I know that. I don't have an excuse that's good enough. I just need you to know. It's done. I played that message 3 times. Then I drove back to Midtown. I want to be honest about what happened over the weeks that followed, because I think the honest version is more useful than a tidy one. We did not immediately fall back together. Christina and I had 2 conversations in May that I would describe as the hardest of my life. Harder than any courtroom, because courtrooms have rules, and grief doesn't. I told her plainly that the issue was not her parents' views, over which she had no control. The issue was that she had made herself the manager of information about me, for months, without my knowledge or consent, in a situation where the information concerned my fundamental dignity. That was the thing I needed her to understand in a way that wasn't just apology. I needed her to sit with it. She did. That's the truth. It was uncomfortable to watch, the way real reckoning is always uncomfortable to watch, but she did it. She went to therapy, not as a gesture for me, but because she recognized, clearly and without my prompting, that the pattern of managing difficult things in silence, rather than bringing them into the room, was something she needed to address. She stopped managing. She started telling me things that were hard. Gerald and Anna Highmore did not come around immediately either, and I'm going to be precise about that, because I think too many of these stories let the family villains dissolve too easily at the end, and that's not what happened. Anna called Christina twice in June. The first call was a continuation of the argument. The second was something quieter. Not an apology, exactly, but a woman in her late 50s sitting with a version of herself she was not comfortable with. Gerald said almost nothing, which Christina told me was his version of processing, and she knew him well enough to know the difference between silence that was closing and silence that was opening. I did not speak to either of them again until July, when Christina arranged a dinner at a restaurant in Buckhead, neutral ground, her word, appropriate, and the 4 of us sat down together for the first time as something approximating the family we were all going to have to figure out how to be. I want to tell you about that dinner, because it's important. And because it did not go the way I might have written it if I were inventing this story. Gerald Highmore looked older than he had on his porch in May. He shook my hand at the table the way you shake someone's hand when you know you owe them something and you haven't figured out how to say it yet. Anna was more direct. She is, I would come to learn. The one in that marriage who eventually says the thing. I want you to know. Anna's voice was steady, her hands flat on the table. What we said, and what we implied, was wrong. It was rooted in something I was raised with that I've spent this summer looking at very hard, and I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight. I just want to say it to your face. I looked at her for a moment. Then, I appreciate that, Mrs. Highmore, I genuinely do. I'm not carrying anything toward you that I'm going to let stand between Christina and me, but I do need you to understand that she is the person who chose me, and I need that to be respected. Fully, not managed. Understood. Anna held my gaze. Her chin lifted slightly when she delivered it. Gerald nodded once. He didn't trust his voice, I think. We had dinner. It was not warm, not that night, but it was honest in a way that meals between new family members rarely are, and honesty is the foundation I know how to build on. My mother Dorothy joined us for dessert. Christina had arranged it, quietly, without telling me, and when I saw her walk in, I understood that Christina was learning, actively, what it looked like to bring people into the room instead of managing them from outside it. Dorothy Harper shook Anna Highmore's hand, sat down at the table, and said with the particular cheerfulness she deploys when she is making a point without making a scene, "My son tells me you've all had quite a spring. I hope the summer's been kinder." And Anna Highmore looked at my mother and laughed, a short, surprised, genuine laugh, and said, "It has. A little." That was enough. For that night, it was enough. Our wedding was not on August 9th. We moved it, by mutual agreement, because both Christina and I felt that the day we'd planned had been built around a version of the situation that no longer existed. And we wanted to start from somewhere clean. We were married on Saturday, September 13th, 2025, in a small ceremony at a venue in Grant Park, a neighborhood in Atlanta that sits beside the Oakland Cemetery, where some of the city's oldest history is buried, and where on a September afternoon the light comes through the trees in a way that feels like something earned. 40 people. My mother in the front row, James Freeman and his wife Helen. And in the third row, Gerald and Anna Highmore, sitting with the careful attention of people who understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of what they were watching. Christina walked down the aisle and found my eyes before she found anything else in that room, and I thought about everything. The proposal on Auburn Avenue, the drive to Marietta, the voicemail at 11 at night, the dinner in Buckhead, my mother's back porch and her sweet tea, and her particular talent for saying the thing I wasn't ready to hear. I thought about what it means to know someone, and about the difference between the person you fall in love with and the person you choose to marry, and about the fact that those two things are not always the same person, and that sometimes, if you're both willing to do the work, they become the same person. I married Christina Highmore on September 13th, 2025, and I meant every word of it. It's June of 2026 as I'm telling you this, and I want to close with something I've been sitting with. There is a version of this story where I find what I found in Marietta and I end things. I think that version was available to me. I think it would have been a defensible choice, and I would not have blamed anyone for making it. There are things that cannot be rebuilt, and only the people inside the situation can know whether this is one of them. What I can tell you is what I actually chose, and why. I chose it because Christina's parents' failure was not her failure, even though she had let their failure become her silence, and her silence had become a wall between us. I chose it because the wall came down, not because I pushed it, but because she chose to take it apart herself. Starting with that phone call, the night I drove to my mother's house, I chose it because a person who calls her parents at 11 o'clock at night and tells them clearly that their views about the man she loves are not acceptable, and that she will not manage around them anymore, that is a person who knows what it means to choose someone. And I chose it because my mother was right, as she almost always is. Shame makes people do stupid, costly, painful things. It does not make them bad people. It makes them people who need someone willing to stay in the room long enough to find out what's underneath it. I am an attorney. I believe in evidence. The evidence, by September of 2025, was that Christina Highmore was exactly who I had always believed she was, underneath the fear. And that was enough for me. If you're sitting with something in your own life that you're afraid to bring into the room, a truth you've been managing instead of sharing, I want you to hear this. The people who deserve to be your partner in this life deserve to be in the room with you. All the way in, not protected from the hard parts. In it. That's the only foundation worth building on. I promise you that. Drop a comment below. I'd love to know what this one brought up for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. You know how this goes. The people in these stories had chances to do the right thing. Some of them did. Some of them almost didn't. Either way, there's always more story. Thank you for being part of this community.